All right, let's jump right in. Ready for a deep dive. This excerpt from Social Science Research, Principles, Methods, and Practices. It's incredible how much it packs into these few pages.
Really lays the foundation, for understanding how we make sense of things and like psych, SOC, even management. It's not just about, facts and figures. It's about actually building and testing explanations.
So we're going beyond just like memorizing definitions and stuff. Like we're going to get into the why behind it all.
Exactly. We'll uncover how researchers go from a question all the way to a solid conclusion. And, the best part is you can apply this kind of critical thinking to everyday life when you come across research, too.
That's a great point. So much research out there these days.
Right. And one of the first things this excerpt dives into is, well, the very nature of scientific knowledge itself. It's not about reaching some ultimate truth, it's more about constantly refining what we know based on what we observe and how we reason through it.
That makes sense. Kind of like how when you were a kid, you thought the sun revolved around the earth. But then, you learn more and you realize that your understanding of the whole solar system was, well, it was totally wrong.
Yeah, exactly. The excerpt uses a really cool example from physics. It talks about Newton's laws of motion. We observe these patterns in the way objects move, right? But the theory of classical mechanics, that provides a deeper explanation for why those patterns actually exist in the first place.
Oh, so the theory is like the framework that helps us connect all the dots, like make sense of the observations.
Exactly. And this brings up a really important distinction, the difference between laws and theories. Because laws, those describe what we see, the patterns, the regularities, right? But theories explain those patterns. They dig deeper into like the why behind it all, the underlying mechanisms.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to see how these layers, these different layers all fit together. But okay, so where do social scientists even begin? Like, how do they even choose what to study in the first place?
Well, they start by asking questions, exploring. You can think of it like a detective, starting an investigation. They don't have all the answers right away, but they gather clues and they look for patterns, and that's really what exploratory research is all about.
So if I wanted to study, let's say, how people are reacting to a new government policy, I might start with exploratory research, kind of like get a feel for the lay of the land.
That's a perfect example. You could conduct interviews, run some focus groups, or even just observe online discussions, just to get a sense of the range of opinions and concerns that people have. It's really helpful in narrowing down your research question and figuring out what to study further.
It's like mapping the territory before you start digging for treasure.
Exactly.
So the excerpt mentions there are different approaches, like to this whole research thing.
Absolutely. And those are, well, they're called paradigms. And there are two main ones, positivism and interpretivism. So positivism that aims for this objective truth, often using like quantitative methods like experiments or surveys to measure and test relationships.
Okay, so if I were a positivist researching that new policy, I might design like a survey to measure how people feel about it.
Exactly. You'd aim to, collect data in this really systematic and objective way, minimize bias, and really focus on what you can directly measure.
Makes sense.
But then on the other hand, you have interpretivism, and this focuses on like understanding subjective experiences, the meaning that people give to, their world.
So like an interpretive researcher, they might be more interested in doing like in-depth interviews to explore how this policy is affecting people's lives.
Precisely. They want to like delve into those nuances of people's experiences and perspectives, recognizing that social reality is complex and shaped by those interpretations.
Interesting. It's like two different lenses,
Yeah.
viewing the same phenomenon. But regardless of which approach you're using, you still have to like define what you're studying,
She
right?
got it. And that's actually where things get a little tricky because it involves measuring, these fuzzy concepts.
Fuzzy concepts.
Yeah, like how do you measure something like happiness or prejudice or even, like organizational agility?
That seems hard. It's not like measuring someone's height.
Right. It's much more nuanced. And this is where the idea of constructs and variables comes in. So a construct, that's the abstract idea you're interested in, like intelligence or motivation. A variable is the concrete way you actually measure it.
Oh, okay. Can you give me like an example of that?
Sure. So let's say we're studying intelligence. Intelligence itself, that's a construct, right? It's this abstract idea. But to study it, you got to use a variable, something measurable. That's where an IQ test comes in. It's a variable that's trying to capture like this really complex construct.
So the IQ score itself, it's not actually measuring like intelligence itself. It's just one way of trying to measure it.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Because how do you know if your variable, like that IQ test, is actually a good measure of that construct? That's where reliability and validity come in.
Reliability and validity, I always get those mixed up.
Think of it this way. Reliability means your measure is consistent. So a reliable scale, it'll give you the same weight every time you step on it. Even if it's not accurate, it's consistent.
Okay, so it's like a clock that's always 5 minutes slow. It's consistently wrong.
Exactly. And that's where validity comes in. Validity means your measure accurately reflects what you're trying to capture. So that clock, it's reliable, but it's not valid, right? A valid scale will actually measure your true weight.
So to be really useful, a measure needs to be both. It needs to be reliable and valid, right? Like it needs to be consistent and accurate.
Precisely. And this is so, so important when you're dealing with these these complex social science constructs. It's all about making sure your research is built on this solid foundation.
I see how this is all starting to connect. Okay, I'm curious. Where do theories fit into all this? Are they just these like big abstract ideas?
That's a common misconception. Theories are actually really practical tools for researchers. They provide a framework, a way to understand the relationships between those constructs and variables.
Okay, so a good theory, it like guides the research process.
Absolutely. It's like a roadmap. Helps you ask the right questions, design the study properly, and then interpret your findings in a meaningful way.
And the excerpt talks about scientific progress,
Right.
and that it involves actually replacing like less accurate theories with better ones over time.
Exactly. And one great example of this is Karl Marx's theory of communism.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from history class.
So initially it seemed like this compelling explanation, for social and economic dynamics. But as history played out and as more evidence was gathered, it became clear that, well, it didn't quite align with reality.
So even influential theories can be challenged and sometimes even replaced. Like science is always like self-correcting.
Exactly. Theories aren't meant to be static. They're meant to be tested, refined, and sometimes, even discarded as we learn more. And that's one of the most exciting things about science. It's this never-ending search for better explanations.
So it's not about being right or wrong. It's about constantly looking for that more accurate understanding of the world.
And to do that effectively, well, social scientists need a clear roadmap for their research. In this excerpt, it outlines a really helpful step-by-step process.
So like a recipe for doing research.
Exactly. It starts with exploration, then moves to research design, data collection, data analysis, and finally, communicating those findings in a research report.
Okay, so we've talked about how researchers, define what they're studying and then how theories provide that framework for their work. But how do they actually structure their theories?
That's where the building blocks come in. Those are, there's constructs, propositions, variables, and hypotheses. It's like the blueprint for understanding the phenomenon.
Constructs and variables we've already talked about, but what are propositions and hypotheses?
Propositions, those are statements that describe the relationship between constructs. For instance, you might say job satisfaction is positively related to, employee performance.
So it's like a statement about how those concepts connect.
Exactly. And a hypothesis takes that proposition and makes it testable. So you might say employees who score higher on a job satisfaction survey will also receive, higher performance ratings from their supervisor.
Ah, okay. So you're taking that idea and figuring out how to actually measure it.
Exactly. And the excerpt even gives a visual example, figure 2.2. It shows this proposed path model that connects intelligence, effort, academic achievement, and earning potential.
I'm a visual learner, so diagrams like that really help me. It's like, seeing the theory in action.
And it highlights another really important concept. The roles variables can play in a hypothesis. So you have like independent variables, those are the ones you manipulate. Then you have your dependent variables, those are the ones being measured. Then you have your moderating and mediating variables, and those can influence the relationships between the other variables.
Wow, it's starting to feel like this really complex system, so many moving parts.
It definitely is. But understanding these building blocks is key to evaluating those theories and, really understanding how research is designed. And it's important to remember, researchers don't just accept theories at face value. They have to think critically about them and assess their validity.
So, like, what are the signs of a good theory? What should we be looking for?
Great question. And that's where things get really interesting. The excerpt outlines some key criteria. First, it has to be logically consistent. Its propositions and assumptions need to, like, make sense together.
So no internal contradictions or like circular reasoning.
Right. Then it needs to have explanatory power. It needs to effectively explain, the phenomenon you're studying.
So it's like the difference between a hunch and like a solid explanation.
Precisely. Good theories are also parsimonious. They explain things as simply as possible, no unnecessary complexity.
Kind of like Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is often the best.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, a good theory, it needs to be falsifiable, meaning it can be disproven through, empirical testing.
So it needs to be open to the possibility of being wrong.
Exactly. If you can't disprove it, then it's not really a scientific theory. And finally, the best theories have, strong empirical support. There's evidence from research that actually backs up their claim.
So it has to prove itself through testing.
And this testing process, that brings us to research design. And that's what we'll talk about next.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into research design. But before we move on, is there anything else about theories that's super important to remember?
One thing that's really important to keep in mind is that building and testing theories in the social sciences, it's tough. Human behavior, it's complex. It's influenced by so many factors.
Though even the best theories, they might not be perfect.
Right. There are limits to what we can definitively prove, But that doesn't mean it's not valuable research. It just means we need to be aware of those limitations and be careful about how we interpret those findings.
That's a great reminder. I'm already starting to, view research differently.
And that's what it's all about, giving you the tools to understand and evaluate the research you encounter.
Okay, let's move on to those design choices.
All right, so let's explore those design choices. The excerpt dives into several key research designs, each with its own, strengths and weaknesses. And one of the most common methods, especially for studying large groups of people, that's survey research.
Surveys. I've definitely filled out my fair share of those.
Yeah.
Never really thought about the science behind them, though.
There's a lot more to it than you might think. Surveys are so useful for tapping into information that you can't directly observe, right? Like you can't measure someone's political beliefs or their satisfaction with the product, but you can ask them about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like getting a window into people's, thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And surveys are great for, studying things on a larger scale. You can reach way more people than you could with in-depth interviews.
But I imagine there are some downsides too, right? Like to using surveys.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest challenges is making sure that your sample, the people you're surveying, actually represents that larger population you're interested in.
So like if you're studying voting preferences, you wouldn't want to just survey people in one neighborhood or, one age group.
Exactly. You'd want your sample to reflect the diversity of, the entire voting population. Otherwise, your findings could be totally misleading.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the excerpt mentions that even with a good sample, there can still be biases in how people respond to those survey questions.
Oh, for sure. One common one is, we call it social desirability bias. Basically, it's the tendency for people to give answers that make them look good or sound good, even if those answers aren't totally honest,
So if you're asking about, like, sensitive topics, like drug use or, political opinions, people might not tell the whole truth.
Exactly. That's why researchers have to be really careful about how they design those survey questions. Using neutral language, avoiding those leading questions that might push people towards certain answers.
Sounds like a real art to it.
It is. There's a real art to crafting those questions. And it's not just about the wording either. Researchers also need to think about, the order of the questions, how long the survey is, and even how it's administered, online, phone, in person, all that stuff.
Wow. It's a lot more complicated than I realized.
It is. But when it's done well, survey research can be this incredibly powerful tool for understanding people's, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, all of that.
So we've got surveys for studying those big groups,
Yeah.
getting a sense of what people are thinking. But what if you want to dig deeper into the why behind it all?
That's where experiments come in. They're really considered the gold standard for establishing cause and effect.
Experiments I always picture like scientists in lab coats mixing chemicals.
Well, social science experiments aren't quite that, dramatic, but they do involve a similar level of control. It's all about manipulation.
Manipulation.
Yeah, you manipulate one variable, it's called the independent variable, while you keep everything else constant, Then you observe the effect on another variable, and that's called the dependent variable.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this straight. If I wanted to test the effect of, say, caffeine on alertness, Caffeine would be my independent variable, and the alertness would be the dependent variable.
You got it. You would give, one group caffeine and another group a placebo. Then you'd measure their alertness levels. And to minimize bias, you'd randomly assign people to those groups.
Random assignment. Why is that so important?
Because it helps ensure that the two groups are as similar as possible at the start, except for that caffeine. So if you see a difference later on, you can be more confident that it's because of the caffeine, not because of some other difference that was already there.
So it helps you rule out those alternative explanations.
Exactly. And the excerpt mentions quasi-experimental designs. These are used when random assignment just isn't possible. But it does make it a little trickier to, interpret the findings.
It's a trade-off then between control and practicality.
Exactly. And the excerpt actually goes on to describe several different experimental designs, each one designed to, answer specific research questions.
Okay, so a whole toolbox of experimental approaches. But what if you're interested in something that's too complex or nuanced to study in a lab setting?
That's where case research is super useful. It's all about exploring a specific thing, phenomenon in a real-life setting.
So it's zooming in on a particular case and really digging deep.
Exactly. Think of those true crime documentaries, right? They go into every little detail of a single case. Case research in social science is similar. You might study a particular organization or, a community, or even just a single individual, just to really understand their experiences.
So instead of trying to control variables, you're immersing yourself in the context, gathering those rich details.
Exactly. And that data can come from all sorts of places: interviews, observations, documents, even, historical records. It's like putting a puzzle together. You're piecing together information to get this complete picture.
That sounds fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It also sounds like it could be really time-consuming, though.
Oh, it can be. And the excerpt, it points out another challenge: making sure your findings actually apply to other cases or situations.
Right, you can't just assume that one case study represents, everyone or everything.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, case research can be incredibly valuable, especially for exploring complex social phenomena and generating hypotheses.
It's like, using a magnifying glass to get a closer look at something.
And speaking of different perspectives, the excerpt also talks about interpretive research. This takes a very different approach to understanding the social world.
Interpretive research. I think I remember us touching on that earlier.
Yeah.
But can you remind me?
Sure. So unlike positivism, which is all about, objectivity and measurement, interpretive research is all about understanding the meaning that people give to their experiences. It acknowledges that reality is subjective, shaped by those interpretations.
So instead of looking for universal laws, you're trying to understand how people see their own lives.
Precisely. And interpretive research, it often relies on what we call qualitative data. So things like interviews, observations, personal stories.
So it's about capturing that richness, that complexity, instead of reducing everything to, just numbers.
Exactly. And the researcher's own perspective, that plays a much bigger role here, In interpretive research, it's not about trying to be this, detached, objective observer. It's about recognizing that your own experiences and biases, they shape how you see the world and how you interpret that data.
It sounds like it's more about empathy and understanding than about just, explanation and prediction.
That's a great way to put it. And while it might not offer, the same kind of broad findings as, say, quantitative research, it can provide deep, really nuanced insights.
Like reading a novel versus a textbook. Both offer different ways of learning.
I love that analogy. And just like different genres of literature, different research methods provide different tools for understanding, human experience and the social world.
Okay, so we've gathered all this data, whether it's from surveys or experiments or case studies or, interpretive research. Now what? That's where data analysis comes in.
Yeah, I got it. It's all about making sense of that puzzle, right? Putting those pieces together. And the excerpt introduces several techniques for analyzing both qualitative and quantitative data. So for qualitative data, you have grounded theory. That's all about building a theory from the ground up.
So you're not starting with a preconceived idea. You're letting the data lead you.
Precisely. The excerpt describes the phases of grounded theory. Open coding, where you identify those initial concepts. Axial coding, where you start to connect those concepts into, relationships. And then selective coding, where you focus on that central category and really refine your theory.
It's like a detective, right? putting all the pieces together to build the case.
Then there's content analysis, which is about systematically analyzing text, to identify themes and patterns. It's like diving into a mountain of documents and, looking for those recurring nuggets of meaning.
Sounds like it involves a lot of careful reading and interpretation.
It does.
Yeah.
And on the quantitative side, you have descriptive statistics, which are all about summarizing and presenting your data. It's like painting a picture with numbers.
So if I did a survey and I collected a bunch of numbers, descriptive statistics would help me make sense of it all and present it clearly.
Exactly. Think of measures of central tendency, like the mean, median, and mode. They tell you about the typical value. And then there are measures of dispersion, like the range and standard deviation, and they tell you how spread out your data is.
So it's all about making sense of those numbers and understanding what they actually tell us.
Exactly. And then we have inferential statistics, which let us go beyond just describing the data, Inferential statistics allow us to test those hypotheses and make inferences about populations based on our sample.
So that's where we start drawing conclusions, testing those theories. Like we take a leap from our data to the bigger picture.
Exactly. The excerpt introduces concepts like the null hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis, p-values, significance levels. It's like this whole statistical language for, determining if your findings are just random chance or if they actually reflect a real pattern.
So it helps us differentiate, real findings from those, like statistical flukes.
Exactly. And it talks about some common tests like t-tests, ANOVA regression analysis. Each one's designed to answer specific types of questions and analyze different types of data.
So each tool has its own purpose.
Exactly. And whether you're working with words or numbers, the key is to be, really rigorous. Be systematic. Be transparent in your approach.
So we've covered research design and data analysis. What else is important when, evaluating social science research?
One of the most important things, which the excerpt emphasizes throughout, is the importance of replication.
Replication.
Yeah, basically it means repeating a study to see if you get those same results. It's like, double checking your work. If a finding can be replicated by different researchers in different contexts, it gives us more confidence that, that it's a real thing.
So it helps, guard against flukes or bias.
Exactly. And replication is crucial for building, a strong foundation for scientific knowledge. It's not enough for just one study to show something. It needs to be confirmed,
Yeah.
supported by other research.
Right. It's a reminder that science is this, ongoing process. It's not about finding some final answer. It's about constantly questioning, testing, refining,
Absolutely. And this whole emphasis on replication, it highlights, how collaborative science really is. Researchers, they don't work alone. They build on each other's work, they challenge each other's findings, and they all, contribute to that growing body of knowledge.
Like a giant puzzle everyone's working on together.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And speaking of working together, social science often involves studying people. And that brings up some important, ethical considerations.
Right. If you're studying people's, beliefs or behaviors or personal experiences, you need to be respectful of their rights.
Right. Absolutely. The excerpt's very clear on this point. Social science research involves, this responsibility to protect the people who participate in these studies.
So what are some of those key ethical principles? What do researchers need to keep in mind?
One of the most fundamental ones is informed consent. So participants have to be fully informed about the nature of the research, the risks and benefits, and their right to stop participating at any time.
So no, tricking people or, pressuring them into participating.
Exactly. Participation should always be voluntary and based on a clear understanding of what's involved. And researchers also need to, protect people's privacy, keep things confidential.
So keeping their personal information safe,
Well,
not sharing it without their consent.
exactly. And researchers have to minimize any potential harm, to those participants, both physical and psychological.
So if you're studying a sensitive topic, trauma or discrimination, you need to be really careful not to cause any distress.
Absolutely. And it's not just about protecting those participants during the study. Researchers also have to think about the potential impact of their findings on, on society as a whole.
So if you're studying something like prejudice or violence, you need to be really careful about how your research might be used.
Exactly. Social science research can have real-world consequences. So it's important to think about the potential for your findings to be to be misused or to reinforce harmful stereotypes.
It's like a scientist who's working on some powerful new technology, right?
Yeah.
They have to think about the risks before releasing it out into the world.
That's a great analogy. And to ensure that, things are done ethically, most research institutions have what's called an institutional review board, or an IRB. They review research proposals and make sure that they meet those ethical guidelines.
So, like, the IRB is the ethics watchdog.
Exactly. They play a crucial role in upholding those standards and making sure research is done responsibly.
Wow, this has really been eye-opening. It's amazing how complex social science research is. We've covered so much, the foundations of scientific knowledge, the designs, measurement techniques, data analysis, those ethical considerations. It's fascinating how it all fits together.
It really is. You start with a question, you dive into the literature, develop a theory, choose your methods, collect data, analyze it, draw conclusions, all while upholding those ethical principles. It's challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
And it's clear that critical thinking is so important every step of the way.
Absolutely. It's not just about, blindly following a method or taking findings at face value. It's about constantly questioning, challenging those assumptions, thinking about things from different perspectives, being open to new ideas.
That's what makes it so, dynamic and exciting. It's a constant search for understanding. And it takes creativity, rigor, and, a real curiosity about the world.
Well said. And speaking of curiosity, I'm curious, what stood out to you most so far? Any aha moment?
For me,
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is like how much goes into research.
Mm.
It's not just about picking a method and running with it.
Mhm.
There's the theory, the tools, the bias, analyzing the data, like so many steps.
It really is like a chain, If one link's weak, the whole thing can fall apart. And that, attention to detail, that's what makes it credible, Makes it trustworthy.
Makes sense? It definitely makes me think differently about the research I see out there, like, in the news or online. I realize I need to be more critical, dig a little deeper, not just like take things at face value.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do here, Equip you with the tools to evaluate those findings, see the
Yes.
strengths and weaknesses, right? And just being a more informed, consumer of information.
Okay, so let's say I'm reading an article and it says, a new study finds that X causes Y. What questions should I be asking?
First, what kind of study was it? Was it an experiment where they actually, controlled things? Or was it more just observational? Like they noticed a connection but didn't actually manipulate anything?
Because correlation doesn't equal causation, right?
Yeah. Exactly. There could be other things going on that the study missed. And always look at, how many people were in the study and who they were. Like, do they actually represent the bigger group they're talking about?
Right, like if they only surveyed people in one town, you can't say that applies to, like, the whole country.
And look for those biases, Was it funded by, a company that would benefit from the results? Did they word the questions in a way that might have, led people to answer a certain way?
Like being a detective,
Yeah,
looking for clues.
exactly. And remember, research is ongoing. One study, it rarely gives you all the answers. It's just like one piece of the puzzle.
So look for other studies on the same topic and see if they all kind of line up.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get into the nitty-gritty. Look at how they defined things, how they collected the data, how they analyzed it. The more transparent, the better,
This makes me realize research isn't just for, like, academics. It's a way of thinking, really. A way of, like, approaching the world.
Absolutely. News, social media, even just making decisions in your own life. These principles, they help you navigate it all.
Like having a secret decoder ring, for information.
And remember, good research. It's got solid theories, reliable measures, the right design, rigorous analysis, and ethical conduct. Can't forget that.
This has been amazing, I feel like I understand so much more about how this all works, the power of research, how complex people are.
And this is just the beginning. This excerpt, it's a starting point. There's a whole world out there to explore. So stay curious, keep asking those questions.
I definitely will. I'm looking at everything differently now. Thanks for, taking us on this journey.
It was my pleasure. And for everyone listening, thanks for joining us. Remember, stay critical, stay curious, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.